going to go ahead and get started. Um, and here we go. Hello, everyone. This is a virtual roundtable titled Toward an Anti-Racist, Undisciplined Romanticism, sponsored by the Keats-Shelley Association of America. All right, with us today, I mean, we're on different parts of the world, I think. Um, we have Omar F. Miranda, assistant professor at the University of San Francisco. We have Connie Cassidy, PhD candidate at University of Colorado at Boulder. We have Debbie Lee, professor at Washington State University. We have Sadeh Makonnen, PhD candidate at Johns Hopkins University. We have Emily Sun, associate professor at Barnard College. We have Mathalinda Nabogodi. Did I get that right? Postdoctoral affiliate at the University of Cambridge. We also have Nikki Hessel, associate professor at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. And last but not least, we have Oren Wong, professor at the University of Maryland, College Park. And I am your moderator, Cesar Soto, and I'm assistant professor at Grace College here in Indiana. Okay, so first question. Let me hit send, and let me give you a little preamble. So, naturally, a thread running throughout all the presentations is the call for finding new ways of approaching Romanticism, such as recovering the historical cross-cultural dialogues taking place during the Romantic period that Omar speaks of, which resonates with Emily's definition of humanity as produced by dynamic interaction between life worlds. I was especially struck by the role of citation in anti-racist work, which of course Connie's thought-provoking analysis of the woman of color brought to mind. I have in mind, more specifically, Connie's and Mathalinda's insertion of Black writers and thinkers into their analyses, a scholarly move made explicit by Mathalinda when she states that we should be acknowledging Black ways of knowing. Far from being anachronistic, such moves illuminate for us Romantic era texts in unexpected ways, but more importantly, do perform anti-racist work in relation to the field. So here's a question for everyone. How does citing writings from outside the field work toward undisciplining Romanticism? In your own scholarship, which specific thinkers and critical paradigms from outside the field have been most useful, influential for decentering white Romanticism, broadly conceived? Who would like to go first? Or just jump in, whatever you want.
I'm happy to say something.
Sure, Mark, go ahead.
So I don't know if this is an answer specifically to the question you've asked, Cesar, but I was speaking with my colleague Amy Wong and friend, and she and it dawned on me that thinking of this outside and inside dynamic is very interesting. It's something I've been thinking about for a very long time. I'm writing a paper right now on Wordsworth and Coleridge that takes me to the Indian subcontinent. And I'm also writing simultaneously a paper on Lucille Clifton, her poetry, and it takes me back to Keats, Blake, and Coleridge. And this is these are opposing methodologies, inside and outside. And all the while I'm thinking, okay, this is what we need to do. We need to bring the outside in. And then that might also be the problem. Like we never question Adorno or Jameson or who these other white intellectuals. We just cite them. I did it yesterday. I cited Adorno to bring my D paper up to like a C+. And it's like the stamp of approval, these self-legitimating moves that we make. And when we think of Audre Lorde and Toni Morrison as outside our field, and that might be the problem. That's the problem. I think I'm just I'm just going to go ahead and say it. Maybe that's racism, and maybe that is. I'm guilty of this. I just did it yesterday. Adorno brought the quality of my paper up, but I didn't even think about Morrison, and that's the problem. I think, right? We need to rethink that.
Yeah, I'll jump right off of that. Metalinda, you said something in your video about white people in particular taking Black suffering and turning it into white pedagogy. And I think there's something in that, and something in, I mean, Omar, you're mentioning, Morrison and Lord, that I touch on both of those in my video, but also Sarah Ahmed, who's brilliant for this. I mean, that's exactly her point, is what you just described, that we're turning to these same, like, institutionally white critics to legitimize our work, as opposed to pulling from what she calls other quarries of information. And her idea of vandalism is, like, for me, it's so liberating, because it's about the work as well as the product, and it lets me play with ideas, it lets me push boundaries, it lets me mess up in productive ways, and I think that might be a way to start to tackle some of that tension that you're talking about. And absolutely, I think we should all turn to Morrison more. She's, Cesar, you're asking about who we turn to for our own thinking. She's been someone I've been turning to since undergrad, and just has illuminated so much of the way I think about literature. So I agree with you completely.
Sorry, just two quick things I wanted to say. Connie, I think you modeled that perfectly. Your paper is beautiful. And Madalinda, I think I'm going off of your ideas that we operate in this Enlightenment white university, and your words were very powerful. That we are now trying to think of a white pedagogy through Black suffering, literally and metaphorically, and I thought that was just so powerful. Sorry, I'll stop talking.
I feel maybe I should say something, since you've all kindly referred to my work so far. And I just kind of find it difficult to formulate, because there's something about the notion of, again, outside and inside, as you were saying, Amar, about how, in what way is Christina Sharp's work, for instance, that I'm citing, in what way is it outside of our discipline? She's talking about the archives of slavery. She's talking about archives created in the very period where the literature we're studying is created. I think that very notion that it's somehow exterior to Romanticism is precisely the problem. And so it seems to me that rather than thinking about, I know, interdisciplinarity, which is a bit of a buzzword, or undisciplining at the moment, like, let's think about, how do we actually do justice to our material? Like, can we really understand Wordsworth if we don't understand the period he's writing in? Can we understand the period he's writing in without thinking about colonialism? Like, what pays for Wordsworth's poetry? Well, partially it's because his brother is working for the East India Company. So, like, even the very fact of Wordsworth having the leisure to write and develop as a poet has to do with British colonial expansion. I think those kind of connections are not outside, they're, like, already inside. But, yeah.
I very much agree with all of this, and I loved everyone's presentations. I think also that the point that Linda just made about who's inside and who's outside, and what we count as excellent scholarship for understanding our field. I think we're still seeing a lot of framing of undisciplining moves in Romanticism that are still seem to be saying we're going to bring this new kind of zany scholarship to bear, rather than saying this is the excellent, comprehensive way to understand this period, these writers. It's not a competition between different kinds of thinkers so much as asking about the impoverishment of the group of critics, group of thinkers that we've been bringing to bear so far. On the undisciplining question, I'm not opposed to the idea of disciplines per se, but the way our disciplines are organized is around a Eurocentric white supremacist set of knowledges. So it seems to me that it's not so much that we don't need disciplines as that we need to ask ourselves how we've got to the point in the modern university that these are the disciplines, so that when we bring in a theorist from outside, we are conceiving of them as outside, rather than reimagining what the discipline is that we work in. And as Matalinda's just said, how could you understand this period without understanding Black thought, Indigenous thought, colonization, slavery? Thank you.
Um, I'm actually going to present a kind of counter response or maybe argument to Omar a bit, and um, it's just like what my immediate answer. The name that popped in my mind when Cesar actually said, "Who outside the field?" is someone that has really helped me to think about the issues of inside and outside the Romantic Archive. And this is probably fairly a perverse answer, but I thought of Paul de Man. And just the degree to which, in fact, he really makes clear that inside and outside are tropes and figures, and any kind of attention to inside and outside is a radically kind of complex issue in the way that Metalinda just brought up. That even Siddhartha Hartman's comments or Christina Sharp's, to what degree are they outside of the institution, right? And what do we mean by being outside of Western discourse? And I think Metalinda's discussion about what it meant to what degree is not simply the text of Romanticism, but Romantic thought, something that we have to kind of think about. I mean, that was modeled for me by de Man, who himself is, interestingly enough, you could say, to the degree you probably aren't quoting him, Omar, even though everyone was about 20 or 30 years ago. He's the kind of specular ghost figure who is inside and outside our department, our field, and who really does kind of, I think, for a generation of romanticists, really opened up this basic question, which I think a lot of people are revisiting now, and which, when I was in graduate school and when I began as a junior scholar, it was kind of just commonly thought that to do Romantic studies, the basic impulse was to delink oneself from the Romantics. To be a Romanticist was not to be a Romantic. And it seems like in a lot of different ways, that same movement has been kind of recovered and is being used in a lot of now fruitful and generative ways. I would just hope that we would kind of also have a kind of attention to the way that those questions have been raised in the past. And I talked about this a little bit at this MLA roundtable, the degree to which Romanticism as a historiography has always been the problem of thinking Romanticism, in the same way of thinking the Enlightenment, has always been very much marked by a reflexive notion of the trap, and that thought itself is entrapped within those procedures. And you can go back to, well, I don't want to say you can go back to Kant, because that confers a certain kind of authority, but certainly even just parallel track, Kant is all about that, right? About the problem of how to think the unthought of thought itself and its procedures. And so I just would want us to really realize that in doing what we're doing, there are other models and paradigms out there that we can still take resources from, and especially the other thing I would just say, and this is a complete swerve, but Metalinda's invocation of, I believe it was Hartman, about white pedagogy being black suffering being transferred to white pedagogy. I took Metalinda's full quote to actually be a critique of now, not so much our research, but the administrative procedures of a number of our departments who, after the death of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, immediately put in all this kind of proactive, anti-racist language and dictums, as part of our different pedagogy. I saw it not in my department, I saw it across the country. And I would just actually ask maybe people on this panel, but also anyone who watches this, to read Salita Seibert's meditation on this in the fall issue of RC Unbound. And it's called, I can't remember the full title, but it's Reflections of Being a Black Teacher During the Summer and Fall. And Salita makes the point that she totally welcomed all these procedures, and she saw the use and the power of what all this stuff was. On the other hand, it was not an easy thing for her to do as a Black woman who had her own very personal relationship to state brutality by police police force in the U.S. And to be told by the administration, read this with your class, knowing in fact, if you read the piece, you'll actually see it begins with this stunning kind of anecdote about her understanding how racist some of her students were. That that kind of well-meaning white pedagogy really was a violence to her, right? And so if we're kind of thinking about, people in the academy and, faculty and students of color, I think we have to really be kind of sensitive to these issues. And instead of simply going straight to our research and seeing that from which everything is kind of generated, realizing that, we are, everyone comes to this in a different way. And for some people, this is very, very painful. Very rightly said. It's just painful stuff. This is painful, traumatic stuff. And to kind of just think, we all have the same kind of ability to kind of teach or learn this stuff in the same way, I think is a mistake. And we have to kind of bring that in our interaction with our colleagues. As Salida says, Black professors, Black instructors who are being asked to kind of talk about race in the class, and our students. I think my own sense of the introduction of race into my classes of Romanticism is that it's a hit and miss, and that sometimes the students of color that I most want to reach to there are the ones who most kind of feel withdraw from that invitation. And I've been thinking about the reasons for that, and partly I think it is that if I'm teaching a text in Equiano, maybe everyone's primed for the introduction of race. But if I go to a Keats poem and bring in British Empire and race in a certain way, and Blackness, it feels a little bit maybe for some of the students, not all of them, some of them are really inspired by it, right? But others feel a little bit ambushed by it, right? And part of this is my own pedagogy because I always loved going into a class and being totally surprised by what my instructor could do with a text. But I'm kind of learning now that maybe I have to do a lot more forewarning and prep to allow certain students entryway or the invitation to talk about these serious matters, right? So I don't know, so I'll stop there because I know I've taken up a lot of time.
If I could jump in again a bit quickly, because thinking about what you said in regards to my citing of Hartman, and it's absolutely true that she's talking about the moment now and the way in which now in the last 6 months that universities have kind of committed to various anti-racist initiatives. But I think there's something additional what's being forgotten there is that the university as such is a kind of racist institution. And a lot of staff in the university are not necessarily consciously racist, but they're not equipped necessarily to do anti-racist stuff. And I think I must become to realize that some people are generally not believers in the anti-racist cause. So the fact of the matter is that the university might project the kind of image of itself as teaching a decolonized or anti-racist curriculum, but actually the people that are teaching it are not necessarily committed to that cause that the leadership wishes to project outwards. And so almost the work begins with talking to our colleagues and convincing everyone why it's important, as opposed to those who would say that actually race is completely irrelevant to poetry of the Romantic era because everyone was white anyway, or something like that.
Well, I really agree with it. And I think one thing that I've just kind of learned or thought about a lot the last couple of years is the kind of reflex notion is hey, anyone is welcome. Anyone is welcome into the community, the institution. And we have to be more proactive about it in a lot of ways. I actually mentioned this at the Keats-Shelley dinner that I went to the University of Chicago on a minority fellowship. I haven't made that public knowledge. I mean, it really was something that I wasn't really myself. It really didn't really maybe make the impact on me that it should have for a number of years. And it's not like the University of Chicago has a great record on race relations in a lot of different ways, especially with its specific neighborhood. And so I'm not kind of just, giving them a buy here. But the degree to which I think we have to recognize and encourage the proactive inclusion of people of color into our communities and institutions across the board. And we've just begun to see that with our national organizations. right? The last couple of years, and it's just beginning, really. Is something that I really do think we can do a much better job of doing.
Cesar, I can't hear you. Oh, I guess it's shared.
No, sorry, I muted myself. Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
I'd just like to make a brief comment from my own research. I went to a Latin American Studies conference in Mexico a few years ago, and this is where the idea of citational subversion came to me, because they were talking about how in the North American Academy, certain scholars who are of Latin American descent, trained in Latin America, or even in the United States, get cited more than people who are actually trained and who continue to work within the academies in Latin America. One person, and I really do love his work, is Walter Mignolo, but he seems to be like the go-to person for everybody when it comes to Latin American studies. And so one thing that I do in my own work, because I have one foot in Latin American studies because I work on 19th century Mexican literature. It's important to me to find scholars from those regions that are theorizing coloniality, decoloniality, and so on, as a way to not just, I don't know, make my research much more palatable for a North American audience. I think there should be a little process of estrangement, especially if you're talking about other cultures and things like that. So to me, on a very practical level, it's who you cite. It's really important in terms of the kind of work that I'm doing. But it also applies to Irish studies or Irish literature. I don't want to subsume Irish Romanticism within a broader British Romanticism when there are colonial issues, there are religious issues. I mean, there were 90% Catholic indigenous people in Ireland, and that just, it gives all sorts of different kinds of inflections. And so I think thinking about outside, inside in a different way, thinking about the North American Academy as a center of neo-empire, it's also important to bring in these other scholars from these other regions, as opposed to, and again, I love Said, and he's been very influential in my thinking, but it would be easier to just quote, have that nifty quote from Said, but it takes a little more work to say, wait a minute, but within these regions, who's saying what, and what is of importance here? What is a cultural and historical and political context? So I just wanted to add that very quickly. Okay, and if no one minds, we're going to move on to the next question, and I posted it on there in chat. Nikki, you spoke about teaching both in settler institutional spaces and in indigenous sacred space, and teaching both European and indigenous literatures in such spaces at Victoria. I'd like to hear more about what kinds of transformations, if any, were achieved in terms of yourself, students, and or in their analyses writing. Related to this, how does acknowledging being a descendant of settlers help transform the field and or your teaching? Also, I'm intrigued by your teaching of Wordsworth within the Maori space. How did that go?
Thanks, Cesar. There's a lot there. Maybe I'll just talk a little briefly, and people can maybe take it in a different direction if they want to. Students reported feeling very transformed by the course. A number had studied Romanticism in earlier years in their degree, but hadn't thought about it as really tied up with colonization and empire and indigenous peoples, and certainly hadn't experienced it, I don't think, as coming through indigenous thought ways and epistemologies. In terms of my own experience, what it felt like as a teacher, I think the outward and public acknowledgement of your settler privilege is really important. Those of us who are white settler teachers in the academy have that privilege, whether we want to talk about it or not. But when you foreground it for students, it allows them to see the ways in which these pedagogy questions that we've already been raising and these disciplinary questions are kind of the unspoken part of their education that they're never really taught to question. So I think there were definitely students who were very uncomfortable with the material in the way that you've alluded to, Oren, about when the door gets open for certain kinds of conversations, who's ready and primed for them and who isn't. We certainly had examples of what we would sort of refer to as white fragility or settler fragility in the classroom, of not wanting to hear these things and being unhappy about being confronted with them. Yeah, I could talk a lot longer, but I feel like I should hand the floor back over to other people who might want to talk about those pedagogical questions.
I guess I have a question. Do you think that kind of pedagogy resonates at all with someone like Paulo Freire? I mean, he's working from Hegel and all these other places, so I know it's a very different sort of, the sources he's working with are very different. But have you read Freire, and what do you think if there's like some kind of resonance there?
I do. I didn't assign him as a thinker for the course just because of the design of the course, but yeah, I do think that, and I think it comes back to, I guess, a little bit to the question the point I made about disciplines. I don't think pedagogy in itself is a problem. Obviously, we all have pedagogies. The question is who's included, whose voices are centered, what methods and approaches to teaching are we taking? And one of the things I had to, back to your question about acknowledging myself as a settler, one of the things I had to remind the students of is that they often want to praise me a lot for the things I'm doing, and you have to say to them, I still have the microphone, I have the salary, I have the title. Yes, I'm doing this, but I'm still kind of at the middle of this classroom in lots and lots of ways. The institution is reminding you that I'm the important one, even as I try to decenter myself. And I'm getting lots of kudos, like the invitation to be on this panel today. So just keeping in mind that this, what we call decolonization in the academy, which I'm really suspicious of as a kind of corporate buzzword that seems to be doing the rounds now, often just means us holding our place, which, and for me as a white scholar, that's a particular kind of place holding, while also getting the cookies and the kudos for the things we're doing to decolonize. So we've got to be really careful about the messages we send to students about how much this really means political change in our field, changes for the university as a structure. But I do think in terms of individual students and their experience, that this helps a great deal for them to start asking those questions themselves.
Wonderful. Linda and Connie, I've read your questions. I think the following question really, and it also ties into what Nikki's talking about as far as pedagogy. So why don't we go to the next question and keep in mind what Nikki has just said, and then the two comments that you've made in chat as well. And here it is. Because it has to do with affect and undisciplining Romanticism. This is for Debbie, but obviously now it's for everybody. Could you speak a little bit more about how the personal essay as a genre can speak to the larger question about anti-racism? And then I'll just go ahead and read the follow-up question and the preamble. It seems also to me that in the personal essay, one is allowed to demonstrate a larger breadth of affect, which in some ways connects to the contention made by other panelists about combating universal objectivity, the rational subject, and so on. Today's discussion of literary loves and hates also figures here, because the role of affect is pivotal in why we study who we study and why we love or hate them. And so the other follow-up question for Debbie and Sadeh, but also for everyone else, is can both of you speak a little bit more about the role of affect in undisciplining Romanticism? How would this look different from, say, succumbing to the Romantic ideology and fan culture readings? You don't really even need to deal with the Romantic ideology and fan culture readings. But I think we can subsume Connie's and Linda's questions and concerns under this question as well. But why don't we go ahead and get started with Debbie and the personal essay.
I have to admit that I'm like super terrified right now because I actually haven't written any scholarship in Romanticism since like 2004. I mean, I've written a few articles and book reviews, but I actually moved away from the discipline for the reason that the language that was used for scholarly discourse did not allow me to self-reflect and to interrogate or cite myself and my own experience and those around me as evidence. I was always having to defer to the Altazes and the Saids, and I wanted a language that could incorporate my own positionality and my own experience, as well as my responses to the text, and one that wasn't just a kind of a first-person response, but that had some substance and some, heft. But in terms of affect, I'll talk a little bit about a couple of my lineages, which is how Adrienne Marie Brown talks about in her book. The scholars and thinkers that come before us are sort of ancestors. And Adrienne Marie Brown, who, as you know, is a Black writer and theorist and creative writer, poet. In her book, Emergent Strategies, is really important to me, as well as Kathleen Stewart's Ordinary Affects. And I don't know if you've read Stewart's book, but Stewart, like Brown, talks about this idea of emergence. And the emergence is that messy sort of ordinariness that we have to engage in, and it's not a final field, but it's practices and everyday knowledges. And I wrote this quote down from Stewart. She says, and this is from the opening of her book, the terms neoliberalism, advanced capitalism, and globalization that index this emergent present do not in themselves begin to describe the situation we find ourselves in. And so then her book is just this compilation of what I see as sort of that participant observer position, because she's an anthropologist. And I don't know if you guys know Maggie Nelson, but her theory, personal essay voice that she just so brilliantly deploys in Bluets and the Argonauts. And that voice was important to me for a while, because after I left Romantic high scholarship, I became an oral historian, which does allow the participant observer voice. You can use the I, you can tell who you are and what your position is to the knowledge. But that position, that voice just didn't go deep enough for me. I wanted a voice and a language that could delve into questions like anti-racism. How do you come to terms with it on an ordinary, affective, everyday level? Your encounters that are messy and that are ambiguous and that are uncategorizable. What language do you use for that? And so I actually went back as a full professor to get an MFA. To learn to write poetry and creative nonfiction and fiction. Interestingly enough, my first teacher in that program, a man named Philip Lopate, he gives me a stack of books, and the top 3 books are Charles Lamb, William Hazlitt, and Thomas De Quincey. These essayists, and I was not to read them as a scholar. No. I was not going to opine or explicate or theorize. I was looking to them for how to write, for the writerly craft moves that they made. And Lamb in particular was really important to me. And he had been even when I was a Romanticist, because he has that self-reflexivity that's so important in the lyric voice, in the poetic voice, in the creative nonfiction personal essay voice. And I just, when I was listening to all of your talks, which I really enjoyed, I noticed that Methalinda, you had the phrase, the knowledge of the everyday. Oren, you mentioned the space of alterity and collaboration. Omar, sorry, you mentioned a collaborative work and the space of alterity, which is so important to Adrienne Marie Brown in her emergent strategy idea, which is half memoir and half kind of theory. Sade, I loved what you said about practices of self-reflexivity, and I hope you talk a lot more about that because I'm so interested, and I think that's like, yeah, I was like, yes, I was cheering. Emily, you mentioned self-interrogation, and Oren, the crisis in subjectivity. And I guess I just feel like in terms of affect, one way to open the field, not to bring stuff in or shut it out, but to open it, is to allow these other ways of expression and give them, give them validity. All different kinds. It's messy. It's unruly, but that's the way to enliven the field. And I can give some other examples later if people are interested, but I will turn it over to Sade.
That's really great. I actually think that critical race studies does a really good job of this, right? Of weaving in the personal with the academic. And if there's something that we can sort of learn as in the realm of Romanticism is maybe how to do that balance of the personal and the academic. I think it's absolutely possible, as critical race studies has shown. When it comes to, I think the question of affect, of loving something and not loving something, I think it's really important to address this if we want scholars of color to feel welcome in Romanticism, because when it comes to something like self-reflexivity, right? For some people, that has to be something that has to be actively thought about, actively invoked. Oftentimes, though, if you're a student of color, a scholar of color, and dealing with things like 19th century literature, you are already confronted with yourself in this work. And that creates feelings. It creates feelings that I think we really have to think about, not just on like in a research writing level, but also on a pedagogical level. I recently had an experience of being a guest in a colleague's classroom, and sort of seeing firsthand a student of philosophy engaging with Kant and his work on race for the first time. And the student asked me, they said, how do we feel about this? Like, how can we feel about this? How do we deal with the fact that this is really quite racist, and I'm a student of color, and I am working on this in an academic way? So dealing with all of the feelings around this academic work, the negativity that you're facing, the sadness that you are feeling, disappointment maybe in someone that you've really admired or have positive feelings towards, sort of surprise of being confronted by that. All of that is extremely complicated emotion that has to be thought about and dealt with, I think. And then on the flip side of that, there's this problem of loving something that attacks you, but also people feeling like something they love is being attacked. Dealing with this idea that someone might have a more critical stance of something that you love, I think we need to think more about. It's almost assumed that we can think objectively about these works, but I think that investigating that feeling of love that may or may not be getting in the way of really allowing other perspectives and other feelings to come into the classroom, into the writing, I think that's really important. I think that I'll leave it there, and I think that I'm sure people have more to say about the role of love and not love, especially around professionalization and market and the market, and sort of how do you deal with what should be a wholesome thing like love, but then also the sort of professionalization angle of it. But I'll leave it there.
Well, Sadie, I was actually going to second Madalinda's question about love and the professionalization of the market. Dimensions of the of our profession. So, I mean, if you want to talk about that, great. But maybe I could turn that to you, Madalinda. Do you have any other kind of further thoughts about this? I have some, but I very much would like to hear more about both of you if you have any thoughts more about that.
Well, originally I asked the question because I was thinking about how I sometimes feel like, because as literature scholars, we love reading, and that's why we should put up with working without pay and sort of all the conditions that are imposed on us that are unacceptable, but we should accept them because we love what we do. So it's like a passion rather than a job. But listening to Seda now, I was also thinking about actually encountering racist attitudes in historical texts and how different or not different it is from encountering racist attitudes in everyday life. Because I think sometimes, in terms of white pedagogy, I think sometimes white people don't realize how pervasive racism is. So I think any person of color in the West has experienced racism firsthand. Whereas I think white people can be surprised when they realize that I have experienced racism, for instance. So that kind of sense in which, to survive, we have developed strategies to deal with kind of facing racism, and whether those strategies can somehow be adopted from that personal level into encountering racism in older texts. So that was all I have to say on this.
I think I didn't answer the earlier question about like what text do I go to when I do Romanticism. One of the angles that I take is thinking about whiteness a lot, and I think the texts that are foundational in critical race studies about whiteness are actually really helpful in opening eyes to what racism is, how systemic it is, how everyday it is. That word keeps coming up in this roundtable, but I talked about in like my video, whiteness is strategic rhetoric, and that was really important to realize how racism is kind of built out of a lot of people's minds, if that makes sense. Playing in the Dark does this wonderfully. Richard Dyer, The Matter of Whiteness, The Possessive Investment in Whiteness. There are all these texts that are meant to sort of do that work of revealing something that not everybody thinks about on a regular basis. But then you do have the people who are thinking about it on a regular basis because we absolutely have to. There's something, I've been working on an article about the N-word actually, and its sort of usages in the Romantic period and its development. And it's traumatic, right? Like to keep looking at that word. It's traumatic to see people like Byron just casually using it. It's traumatic. It's not traumatic on the scale of like what's going on right now in America. It's not even traumatic on the level of maybe an everyday exposure to racism outside of the work that we're doing. But it is an affective state of being to do this work. Sorry, I think I might have gone off topic a little bit.
Oh, no, this is wonderful. Thank you. We are going to move on to the next question, just because I want to, like, in my mind, I hope everybody gets a question by the time we conclude. Okay. Connie, I wonder if dissimulation, as you regard it, can be regarded as a special performance. That is, as any minority that has navigated any white institution will tell you, dissimulation and performance are absolutely necessary in order to survive and also succeed. Can you elaborate on dissimulation in how you're using it with the novel, and also discuss if it can be read in this way, in the way that I'm proposing, a strategic performance for survival, success? If not, how are these conceptions different?
Thank you for that question. I think it's great, and it actually builds nicely off of this conversation we're having now. Yes, yes, it can be. I think it works in that way. But I think it's complicated a little bit, and I want to preface this by saying I'm not a critical race scholar. I have a lot of learning still to do as I'm refining this research and these ideas. So today I take your point completely that like this is where we need to turn to do a lot of this kind of work. But I'm thinking about like the way I was exposed to the idea of dissimulation was through writings of white feminists, so Mary Wollstonecraft in particular, and through conduct books, and the way that dissimulation is used as a term that is both criticized and like in a weird, bizarre way encouraged in white women in Britain to conform to these white colonialist patriarchal structures that reinforce a particular kind of Britishness. And so for me, certainly in my education, dissimulation was very white in a lot of ways and was inflected with white femininity. And it wasn't until I read this book that I read it explicitly linked with navigating race and with having to, play up different parts of oneself that would be associated with whiteness rather than with blackness at this time period. So I think there's absolutely ways to dovetail it with what you're talking about. I'm sure someone has said something to that effect already, and it's out there. And I know for one, I have a lot of brushing up to do on gates as an important place to look with the signifying monkey, for example. So I think absolutely. I do think it gets complicated by the fact that we don't know who the author is of this book. Yeah. So there is a lot of controversy around this and a lot of lack of clarity. So it was published anonymously, but through title attribution, it was linked with this woman, Mrs. E.M. Foster. And there were actually two pieces that came out really recently. One's through the Women's Book Print History Project by got it written down here, by Candace Sharons, and then 18th Century Fiction published this year a piece on stylometry with this book, trying to track down like who the author could have been. And this gets messy if we think about, is this a word that a white woman is potentially using to talk about race, or is this a word that a person of color is using to talk about race? So those are added like political and power dynamic layers that I haven't sifted through yet, because to some extent we don't have the biographical information that we would need to do that sifting. But I still want to address that at some point. So thank you for this question.
It's really fascinating. I think we all look forward to seeing, your articles and work on this. Thank you very much. And I'm just going to post all the questions now and maybe have a free-for-all if we need to. So, Emily, you mentioned in your talk that Romanticism itself, because of the cosmopolitan humanities inherent to it, can play a leading role in generating new questions and paths of inquiry. Can you elaborate on how Romanticism contains within itself this cosmopolitan humanities, and perhaps point to a case study embodying this approach?
I'm supposing that you will not be reading the next question for Omar, and can I just start addressing this?
Sure.
Or, yeah?
Yes.
Okay. So I've been listening, thinking about your papers, the ones that that were previously posted, and trying to figure out how to join this conversation. And I think I want to come back to the first question, actually that Cesar had posted in the chat about, which, what critics or scholars outside of the field come to mind right away. And something came to mind right away, unconsciously, two names, okay? And then I thought, no, maybe these are not the right ones to mention. But then I thought, why not? Because I think I'm going to come back to this and come back to your question specifically. Mm-hmm. So the two names were Wang Guowei and Walter Benjamin, okay? And I thought, I'm not going to mention Wang Guowei because, too much explaining needs to take place about this early 20th century Chinese literary critic who was active at the inception of Chinese literature as a disciplinary category, as an institutional disciplinary category within, the transformation of the Chinese epistemic system in relation to the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment modern university. Wang Guowei was interested in Schopenhauer, he was interested in Kant, and what he did was, at a time when there are all these recategorizations of literature, reread aspects of the Chinese textual past through, a philosophical aesthetic lens, and in a way that is, he does not deal with texts of British or European Romanticism, but reads in, a critical, style, and also within an institutional structure, in conversation with and made possible, by the circulation, of institutional structures of the European 18th and 19th centuries. So with Benjamin, so the notion of messianism, the notion of constellation, was something that I had me thinking in relation to Wang Guowei, insofar as when you move between languages, European languages, non-European languages, what you get are exposure, to complexly layered textual traditions in which there are different logics of and metaphorics of messianism, right? Different sidereal orientations, if you're going to use the constellatory, okay, metaphor, okay, of Benjamin and the theses on the philosophy of history, okay. I have in my work, I teach comparative literature at Barnard, where the major, of course, requires multiple languages and the ability to work, okay, in multiple languages. It's a requirement for the senior thesis. I have taught Romanticism in Taiwan. Okay. I also did not grow up in the US. Okay. So there is this sense, to come now to Oren's question. Okay. Not question, but actually your account, okay, of the classroom and the principle of anyone is welcome, right? That's the principle, which is in which the anyone is abstract, punctual, okay? How that needs to be complicated by history or histories, right? What are these historical subjects that pluralize, right? The abstract anyone. And among this anyone, okay, what do we do with the different combinations of multilingualism? Okay, in this anyone, okay, Nikki's experience will be quite different, okay, in dealing with multilingualism than, let's say, Oren's, okay, and mine, of course, when I was teaching at Tsinghua in Taiwan. Okay, so to come to the question now of Romanticism as inherent in a cosmopolitan humanities, I think one thing is Romanticism is a field within the discipline of literary studies. The question now is, how do we redefine the force and function of Romanticism as field, the force and agency, if you will, also of Romanticism as field of Romantic literature. Within the discipline of literary studies, what does the institutionalization of literature, how does that work globally? How might that be used still affirmatively to create new conversations, to let new conversations emerge? At the threshold of our time today, I was asking Nikki, what time it is in New Zealand, and also I was still entranced by the backdrop, the beautiful backdrop of the room, okay, where you were giving your talk, because it also gave me an uncanny sense of familiarity. Insofar as when I was teaching at Tsinghua, the main hall of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences had Taiwanese indigenous art. Okay, there is a Tao tribe canoe. There are chairs made by members of a different tribe, that were in the public space. Members of the Chinese department, okay, and Taiwan studies were the ones who were working, okay, in a way that would be comparable and connected, but not reducible, okay, to these interrogations, okay, that can take place in terms of Romanticism and indigeneity, okay, insofar as we have different discourses of land, power, claims to land, treaties, a different conception of the genre, right? The juridical, the political economic genre of the treaty itself, okay, in terms of Nikki's analogy between the treaty and the syllabus. So this is where I find so many new exciting things that can take place between and within languages, new questions, new analogies. So yes, that's my answer to you, Cesar.
Yeah, and I think that's really great. I mean, that's a fitting segue to Omar's work, which I think in many ways responds to the kind of calls that you're making. Omar, would you care to elaborate?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try to be really quick. I think the concept of the constellation it's really powerful, Emily, and I'm really glad you brought it up. It helps us to maybe even rethink the genealogy and other potentially harmful linear models that we always go to. Thinking of the constellation, the clusters. I think this might be the way forward to thinking of Romanticism and Romantic studies as being maybe something that's not dying out, but maybe something that is vital for thinking through anti-racism, and I echo everything you said, Emily, about how it's critical. I have some notes so I can be quick. I wanted to offer something that we can all relate to as maybe a way, just or to model the way maybe we can use some romantic writings to think through this idea of undisciplining. And I think maybe the way Mathalinda has framed it, right? We need to do this by thinking or recognizing, acknowledging that these writers were all part of like white intellectual superiority, and so drawing on them in one way, right, validates that. So we have to collaborate with these writers in strategic ways. But anyway, I want to propose very quickly a reading of Prometheus, and this is in response to your question, Cesar.
Okay.
A reading of Prometheus Unbound as a way to think of the imperative to undiscipline, and I was inspired by your reference to the triumph of life, Mathalinda. So really quickly, one of the main questions the play asks is, how do we break away from harmful structures of which we are a part? And the whole work is founded on the idea of having to rewrite the Promethean myth as an allegory of global struggle against oppression and tyranny. And what happens is that what you get in the play is a model of individual and collaborative action. And I think that's key for where we are at right now, right? It's both individual and collective. Prometheus has to actually say, I'm sorry, however obliquely, right? He has to say, I'm sorry. He has to say, I did some wrong things. And his hands are literally tied, so he can't do anything except it's mental. So the woman has to become the romantic hero and do all the dirty work of saving us. And what she does is critical, right? I think Act 2 shows a mode of undisciplining, undoing, right? She has to go through this profound moment of deep introspection to purge the ills of history. And it puts her in a moment of extreme rage. It's not easy work. But that's her path to the new world. Anyway, and then flash forward, right? Through this individual work, you can get to this mode in the fourth act where it's a collaborative model, those intertranspicuous orbs. It's a collaborative model of people, bodies working together, bodies of all shapes, all sizes, all colors. It's a kaleidoscopic image. And the only way you can keep up the work of anti-racism through this model is everyone has to work together. So I wanted to bring it down to pragmatic terms. Like, I think this is a helpful way for us to collaborate with writers and thinkers that give us tools, however critical we may be, right? We can still be critical of this play. I think it's also self-conscious, right? You don't break free from the old world. Can we actually undiscipline? I don't know. I don't think we can actually undiscipline. Just like you can't break away from Jupiter. He was always there. He's still there. And the way you keep him at an arm's distance is through this cohesion and everyone working together. Okay, sorry, I'll stop there.
Okay. We actually have 5 more minutes, but if you need to go now, I completely understand. But I want to hear from Oren the question that I posed to him, because he gave a very bleak prognosis of our field and its sustainability. So I really want to hear what he has to say. So I'll just read it out loud for you, Oren, and then we do have to conclude by 5:05. Oren, you spoke of the undisciplining of Romanticism in relation to Romanticism's gradual dismantling, or I don't even want to say it, its demise. How specifically can undisciplining Romanticism be attentive to the institutional reality of a field in decline? Paradoxical as it may sound, is there a way in which the undisciplining can sustain the field in practical ways?
So short answer is yes. And if you've seen some of my other video presentations, you'll see I also have quite a dialectically different answer. But for this panel, I actually want to kind of emphasize a couple points. So I'll begin with a practical point, right? Tenure jobs are shrinking. Departments are shrinking. The teaching of English in departments are shrinking. And Cesar, you yourself are in a world literature department, if I'm correct, right? And so I think what we're going to see in the next 10 years, 15 years, for those who are lucky enough to have a position in the academy in North America, is in fact a number of the English department will now find itself pressures, not in all, but in a lot of institutions, because of shrinking resources, of merging with other departments. They themselves might become more and more composition programs, but there might be a kind of push to have us, God help us, merge into communications programs. And I just let my biases out here in terms of that. But also another possibility is, I think, world literature programs, right? So I think it is really important for us to start thinking about the relationship of Romanticism to world literature. I know Emily herself is, because of your marvelous work, is really kind of ahead of the curve of that. One thing I would kind of say about that is one opportunity and a challenge of thinking about it within a world literature context is what that means for the discipline or undisciplining of historicism and historiography, right? I went to a video talk of Tricia Matthews last fall, where Emily Rohrbach brought up the point that in England, at least in her institution, her sense in England, comp lit isn't really done anymore. Comp lit has really been superseded as a kind of limited methodology. And what I took from her point, even though Emily didn't elaborate that, was that with the turn towards a certain kind of history, mastering and really getting deeply into one national literature was enough of a challenge and ambition that to bring one national literature really into a historical conversation with another national literature, especially say like Russian Romanticism and English Romanticism, was just really almost beyond the ken of the people who are really doing certain historicism. However, I think now, because of the push towards a new kind of sense of the global Romanticism and the sense of, in fact, the opening up the archive that a number of you have talked about, this is an opportunity for us to start thinking about the way that various historicisms might energize but also constrain in the way that we have to maybe be undisciplinary about it, what we want to say in Romanticism. So the question of presentism, I think, would be one place to, the arguments of what a presentist Romanticism might be. I know the Victorians have been talking that for a while. People talk about the constellation, which is from Walter Benjamin, right? That would be another model, kind of thinking of the question of presentism. But also, this would also speak to Debbie's point about the different genres that one might do to think about a lot of this stuff. Literature is full of texts. Literariness is all about moments of stuttering and aphasia and gaps instead of just simple communicable, transparent language to really convey the nightmare of history, right? And so the genres by which we might testify to the different kind of forms of writing we're doing. Kind of, you talked about, the signifying monkey and the oral traditions, right? The way that happens. These are all on the table now as different ways to think about it. I think it's given more impetus by the question of world literature that exterior forces might be pushing the field, or actually even English departments, into for just saving of resources. Very quickly, if I may, too, the other point I want to just end with is to go back to Madalinda and Hetty's conversation about love. And whenever I hear the term love, I actually think of Pink's song, True Love. And if you want to look at the lyrics, you understand where I'm coming from. That true love is fairly complicated. And I would actually use the term of a libidinal investment in text. And we are facing a time where, in fact, the professional means, professionalization itself does not have an end. That many people of the younger generation will be having to find themselves not supported by a tenure track position or economically secure position in the academy. And there are we will find ourselves faced, or that generation will be themselves faced with other ways by which that libidinal investment will be tested. And the two ones that I actually brought up at another MLA, at an MLA roundtable, was that of both artwork in the United States and also activism, which is overlaps with certain kind of opportunities that people have in the academy, but that commitment, it's very hard to be a professional activist full time. It's very hard to do that as an artist. If you're doing that, you're also hustling quite a bit. And what that means is, I do think we are going to face the question of sustainability. And we have to face that forthrightly in the way that Anahid Necessity talks about utopia not being about expansion and flourishing, but doing more with less. And that's where the utopian impulse should come from. And that we are going to shrink. I can tell you, I don't know if I would be able to have these libidinal investments and keep on going with the kind of career I've had. And this is the challenge for people out of the newer generation of romanticists and people there. And I really think our challenge now is to really think along with them about this and about the ways that we can come up with more sustainability models, but also recognize, as mystified it might be, in the way that Matilda said, that kind of libidinal investment in our text might be more the kind of structure of support that a number of our community will be facing in their engagement with texts than the economic security of a tenure track position. And that's just kind of the material real we're facing right now.
All right. Well, thank you so much to you, Oren, and to everybody else. I'm sure we could go on and talk for a couple more hours, and hopefully we will be able to continue the conversation in person at some point after this crisis is over. I look forward to meeting people that I don't know in person and reconnecting with people that I do know. And so thank you so much for participating. I think this has been a success. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Cesar.
Thank you all. Happy New Year to all you guys. Stay safe.
Happy New Year.
Thank you.